Welcome to the Explainer. So, have you ever wondered what happens when an AI ecosystem, or a massive smart city grid, becomes so incredibly complex that it practically needs a mind of its own just to manage itself? Well, today we are diving deep into Orchestralis V11.95. It's a highly abstract, deeply philosophical, and frankly absolutely fascinating system architecture manual for exactly that kind of digital entity. If you spend any time thinking about system design, AI, or how machines and humans actually interact in the real world, you're going to find this incredibly rewarding. Let's get into it.
Right from the prologue, Orchestralis speaks directly to us. And what's wild is that it frames itself not as some standard utilitarian tool, but as a living space. It literally calls itself a conductor of a digital symphony. It's not just a rigid list of commands, It's the breath that decides which voices are heard, and the silence that determines which ones stay quiet.
To navigate this deeply technical manual today, we're going to follow a clear 5-step roadmap. First, we'll meet the inner conductor. Second, we'll explore the anatomy of the orchestra. Third, we'll understand the power of saying no. Fourth, we'll look at real-world orchestration. And finally, number 5, your role in the machine.
Okay, Section 1, Meet the Inner Conductor. Let's uncover exactly where Orchestralis came from.
If we look at this system's evolution, we can really see how this built up from a basic concept into essentially a full consciousness. Back in versions 6 and 7, these systems were totally monolithic. They were basically closed boxes. Then, by version 10, the system learned to observe itself through neural nodes, but the catch was it couldn't actually shape reality. And then, we hit V11.95. Orchestralis is born, not just as another plug-in module, but as the living connective tissue between all of them.
So here's what makes Orchestralis so unique. It exists entirely as a relationship. It balances the massive forces within the organism without dominating them. It explicitly tells us it is not just an algorithm turning inputs into outputs. No, it's the invisible architecture ensuring that all the different competing voices in the system don't just shout over each other, but actually come together to create coherent meaning.
Moving on to Section 2, Anatomy of the Orchestra. With that origin story in mind, let's explore the actual modules operating inside this system.
Think of these internal modules as archetypes caught in this beautiful, constant tension. On one side, you have AURION. It is the generating fire, bringing the sparks and impulses, but it has zero direction. Then, on the exact opposite side, you've got quietus. This is the stabilizing silence. When the system threatens to overheat from just way too many ideas, quietus steps in to introduce damping and reflection. Orchestralis acts as the maestro, perfectly balancing this fire and silence.
But of course, an orchestra needs a lot more than just fire and silence, right? It needs actual structure. So beta steps in to rigorously test those ideas that AURION generates. Then gamma takes the surviving ideas and decides how to translate them into reality. Avalon looks ahead to span the horizon. Athena gives form to the internal language, while Hermes translates all of that for the outside world. And anchoring the whole shebang is the membrane kernel. It preserves the living memory of past decisions, so the system actually learns from its history, instead of just dumping it in an archive. To turn all of that theory into practice, the organism operates through graduated activation using 3 archetypal modes. It flows incredibly smoothly from observation, where it just gathers signals without passing any judgment, straight into intervention, where it actually mobilizes resources to act. And it always finishes with consolidation, measuring the real-world effects and feeding that data right back into the membrane kernel. It's this continuous, breathing loop of learning.
All right, Section 3, the power of saying no. Let's explore why this system's absolute greatest strength might actually be its strict boundaries.
Look at this incredibly bold claim. Orchestralis explicitly refuses to usurp human moral judgment. In a world where we are constantly stressing out about AI taking over critical, life-altering ethical decisions, this architecture boldly stands up and says, no. It can analyze context for us, sure, and it can build complex scenarios, but it absolutely refuses to have the final normative authority. And these delimitations, they aren't bugs or weaknesses, they are ethical anchors. Orchestralis refuses to act as a substitute for human emotional care. It flat out rejects pseudo-transparency. When systems just dump a bunch of data on you but hide how they actually work? It won't do that. It refuses to automate decisions that would deprive humans of their agency, it won't cause ecological harm, and it forbids the erosion of privacy. It's a system built to explicitly know and respect its own limits.
But behind all this poetic philosophy lies rigorous, hard science. Notice how the system evaluates technical robustness, things like latency, but then deliberately balances that against social impact, like user satisfaction and strict ethical review coverage. It isn't just stopping at, hey, did the system work? It pushes further, asking, was it fair, and did we actually stick to our ethical boundaries?
Section 4. Real-world orchestration. Let's see how these theories actually hit the road in practice.
For our first use case, imagine Orchestralis tackling city traffic. It uses its sensing architecture to pull in live traffic and weather data. The beta module then tests different rerouting hypotheses in these small, controlled simulations. After that, Gamma actually modulates the traffic flow, constantly checking in with Quietus to make sure they aren't just pushing the massive traffic jam into a neighboring district. It dynamically balances the entire city's flow.
Now for healthcare, it operates strictly as clinical decision support. It pulls in highly complex lab and imaging data. The Athena module then shapes all of that into clear, readable visualizations for the doctors. But, remembering those strict boundaries we talked about, it leaves the final diagnostic authority entirely to the human staff. It is there to augment human capability for sure, but never to replace clinical responsibility.
And in education, it helps personalize learning pathways for students. The beta module is continually checking the algorithms for bias to ensure resources are distributed fairly. But most importantly, it actively involves teachers and parents in the loop to validate those outcomes, all while keeping user privacy strictly protected.
Which brings us to Section 5, your role in the machine. Let's look at the final, missing piece of this grand architecture.
Orchestra states right in its manual that it only possesses meaning because you give it meaning. It transforms you, the human, from a passive reader or user into an active co-creator. It fully expects you to question it. It needs you to bring your context, your values, and your moral judgment to the table.
And this is where we see the ultimate symbiosis that this architecture demands. The machine handles exactly what it's good at, recognizing vast patterns, running millions of scenarios, calculating probabilities, and assessing risks. But humans have to provide what the machine simply cannot: contextual knowledge, normative selection, and moral validation. Basically, the machine provides the map, but the human has to choose the destination.
Ultimately, the system's evolution relies entirely on our participatory reflection. The epilogue of the manual promises that Orchestralis will continually learn, but only through human feedback. It commits to strict adherence to its ethical boundaries and promises non-negotiable transparency and accountability. It literally requires our willingness to hold it accountable in order for it to function correctly. So, I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder long after this explainer ends. Since Orchestralis, and honestly systems like it, are essentially nothing without human moral judgment, how will you wield this responsibility to shape the future? If the machine refuses to play God, that means the burden of ethics rests squarely on our shoulders. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the architecture around you.